Okay. Uh, I, good afternoon, everybody. Someone good evening. I would like to thank each one of you for your presence. For me, it's very important because it's our first DECLEN's event, and because of this, before moving on to Sandew Hira lecture, I think it's necessary to summarize and to outline some main ideas of DECLEN. DECLEN is an interinstitutional network based at Catholic University of Brasilia, but also involves other universities as Federal University of Paraná, University of São Paulo, State University of Rio de Janeiro, and of course, another Brazilian and foreign research. DECLEN is also an open group, and it's necessary to say because it's not just for formalized academics in institutional education, but it's also for careers members, which means we have public prosecutors, public defenders, we have also judges, because we think it's necessary to decolonize the official law and the theory of law, also to think about our practicals in judge cases. We can maybe say that we have three lines, main lines of research. The first one is legal decolonization. The second one is the colonial constitutional law. And the third one is the colonial comparativism studies. These three lines, I think we can, with these three lines, maybe we can answer or not answer, but just pursue the principal objectives of our network. We want with DECLEN to deepen the decolonization and the post-coloniality and the colonial comparative discussion. Excuse me, sorry, I need to admit another person. We want to, with DECLEN also to deconstruct the traditional legal theory. And of course, we want to rethink the critical legal studies in Brazil in the 90s that was usually thought from some variables like struggle of classes, access to justice and emancipation. And we want to think from other variables like race, like gender, like ethnicity, sexual orientation, and immigrant flow, maybe traditional communities, which means that we need to occupy with the people that are usually historically subordinated, marginalized by the official law. We want also in DECLEN to investigate how we can think new fields or maybe non-traditional fields of research. How can we avoid a new reformulation of coloniality and colonialism of Brazilian legal theory? We want also to deterritorialize the legal episteme from the global north to our proper problems, our proper reality, because we have some idiosyncrasies. Of course, we are ex-colony like the other countries of Latin America, but we have a singularity. We have some similarities, but we have a singularity that must be thought. And we want with DECLEN also to encourage and to incentivize a legal practice to diagnosing the minimum colonialism and minimal coloniality that we have in our legal theory. I think these are the most important ideas of DECLEN. And I think we can, in this moment, go to Sandew Hira's lecture. And I would like to to, first of all, to thank Sandew to accept our invitation. Sandew Hira is director of the Institute of Scientific Research, in which he is also the chief editor of a book series titled Decolonizing the Mind. He's also a general secretary of DEAN. DEAN is the Colonial International Network Foundation, and he has a forthcoming book titled also Decolonizing the Mind, a practical and a theoretical guide. Thank you, Sandew, for your presence, and it's up to you.
Thank you for inviting me, Guillermo. It's an honor. I'm very glad to be able to have conversations with specialists in law. I'm not a legal scholar, so you might wonder, if I'm not a legal scholar, why do I work on decolonizing law? But I'll explain that I'm a decolonial theoretician, and that's the way I look at law. So let me share my screen, and then I'll go into the presentation. So I'm currently writing this book. I'm finishing it at the end of next month, and it will be published on January the 15th. And it's about 600 pages. I've been working on it for 12 years, and it deals with the why is there a decolonial movement now? Then the two Eurocentric philosophies of liberation, which is liberalism and Marxism, which have a big impact from the European Enlightenment on many thinkings in the world. I'll deal with mental slavery and the mechanisms of colonization of the mind. And then I go into science, fields of science, which is epistemology. I have a specific theory, decolonial theory of reason. I have a chapter on decolonial mathematics and natural science, one on world history, economic theory, social theory, political theory, cultural theory, and a chapter on imagining a new world civilization. And the law is, for me, part of political theory, which I will explain later. Now, so what is decolonial theory? I have a specific definition of it. It's a theory about the rise and decline of the Western colonial world civilization and its impact on the globe. So decolonial theory is not just epistemology or post-colonialism or whatever labels you have. I link it to the concept of civilization. And the decolonial theory looks at how the current world civilization, which I call the colonial world, how did it rise and how is it now in its final stage of decline? And that system, colonialism, I define also as a global system of institutions, of economic, political, social, and cultural institutions that has been created in order to rule the world by the colonizer as we know it now. So decolonial theory is linked to the concept of civilization, and not just notions about epistemology or whatever. And decolonial theory is, as far as I'm concerned, is not just, there are many attempts and contributions of decolonial theory. And I develop a specific form of it, which is based on the concept of decolonizing the mind. And why do I use it? Because in my view, decolonial theory should develop into a comprehensive, coherent, and integral theoretical framework. And comprehensive means that it should produce concepts of how to look at the most important dimensions of society. So it should give you an idea of a worldview of economic, political, social relations, including relations with nature and culture. So a comprehensive theory is not only about race and class and epistemology, etc. It's not only about knowledge production. It's a view on these main fields, areas of a civilization. Then a coherent framework means that if you develop context, these concepts shouldn't contradict each other. They should be consistent and logical. And integral means that all the different dimensions are not just lumped together. Economics, politics, so are not different things. They have a basic concept. And in liberalism, which is a comprehensive, coherent, integral framework, the basis is individual freedom. And in Marxism is class struggle and the concept of class. And in decolonial theory, in my opinion, is mental slavery and decolonizing the mind. It's the basis for developing this framework. So what I do in the book, I look at how from this basic concept, economic, political, social, cultural theory has developed. Few on world history, few on philosophy. And that is basically how I develop this theoretical framework. And from there, how I look at law, you see. And then I developed an approach of how to decolonize a discipline, whether law, whether economic theory, whether social theory. How do you do that? And in my view, is that decolonizing a discipline consists of 3 steps. One is a critique of Eurocentric knowledge production. It's a critique of Eurocentrism and the European Enlightenment. So we look at the European Enlightenment, which laid the foundation of Eurocentric science. And in each of the disciplines, we are looking what are the concepts they have produced. And then once we identify the concept, we go, we criticize those concepts. If we think the concepts are wrong or biased or Eurocentric, we should explain why. And why is it wrong? Then if you criticize a discipline, you should formulate the alternative. What are alternative concepts? And how are they comprehensive, coherent, and integral? And then the last step is, once you have this alternative theoretical framework and the critique, you should be able to translate that knowledge into viable policies of how to build a new pluriversal world. Now, if I apply this and develop it further, I start with the critique of a discipline. And I'll take mathematics, which I do it because you don't expect mathematics to be able to be decolonized. So we look at what are the key concepts in mathematics. And there are many. I just take 2. One is the concept of the historiography of mathematics as a Greek invention. And we show that the Greeks basically got their knowledge from Africa, which is contested by a lot of people, but I stand by it, and I defend that in the book, that the Greek got their knowledge basically from Africa, and I do that on the basis of the original sources of the Greeks themselves at the time. A second concept in mathematics is the axiomatic approach. And an axiom in mathematics is a proposition which don't need proof. So I look at this concept, and then I look at the concept with an instrument which I developed in the book, and that is conceptual thinking. And conceptual thinking means that we look at the concept as some idea of how the world, the natural and social world look like. For example, the concept of the discovery of America, and that concept, I analyze it in 5 dimensions. One is with what is the terminology used. You could have the discovery of the Americas, or you could have the occupation of Americas. You look at what observations are used in that concept. For example, the study of Columbus is one way to look at it, or the study of genocide is another way to look at it. Then the third thing is you build an analysis from the concept. So the analysis of the discovery and the storyline is about modernity, about is about the voyage of Columbus and how he came to discover a new world and began a new era in world history. And from the perspective of the people of Abya, as we call Americas, that is a story of genocide and the facts and the study which have been to basically decimate the population of Abya. And then the fourth element is put that analysis in a theoretical framework, and the theoretical framework of the discovery is the rise of modernity. And that framework is a different framework where from a decolonial view, we would say the rise of barbarism, not of modernity, which is then the other side, barbarism of modernity. And the last one is ethics, because while in the Western Enlightenment, science have removed ethics from knowledge production, in decolonial theory, I argue that ethics is part of knowledge production. So that's a tool, a conceptualizing tool to look at science, at the discipline. So the next thing is, in the whole development of the critique, is that we put the concept to empirical test. So how do this concept hold if we look at the actual representation of reality? And what are the practical implications, and what's the mathematics of the Greek or African invention? Does the axiomatic approach produce better results than the empirical approach in mathematics? And then we look at how other civilizations dealt with similar problems. We look at how mathematics or social sciences or economics or law have been dealt with in other civilizations, and see if there is validity in concept that has been produced there. And the Enlightenment has just shoved them off as irrelevant, but we argue that there might be interesting concept there that we might use for today. So I already went into the thing of the concept. I also forgot to go to the 5 elements of the slide, but let me go to the second aspect dimension of decolonizing the mind, which is the building the alternative foundations of knowledge. After we assess that there are fundamental flaws in mean concepts, so and then we look at whether there are other concepts that we can use, and then how does it translate in policies? Because knowledge is used for developing policies in Eurocentric scientists, and their concepts are used in everyday life. So we offer a critique of the policies, and therefore also an alternative, and that's why decolonial theory becomes part of social movements that want to change the world. It's not just an academic exercise. So let me go to law and take a theoretical view, a decolonial theoretical view of how to look at law. And in that perspective, I locate law as part of decolonial theory. I don't see it as a discipline independent of political theory. So, and because I define political theory as the study of the formation, institutionalization, perpetuation, and the challenge of power in society. And power is expressed in control and administration of states and communities on the one hand, and also the social struggle against that control and administration by social movements. And law is part of that system of power. It's part of the political order of power. And in the book, I deal with the political order, with decolonizing law, and with decolonial strategies. So, and then I deal with different concepts in constitutional law. I will deal with 3 of them now, but in the book, I also dealt with parliamentary democracy and how to look at the validity of that concept. So I went into 3 specific concepts. One is the separation of church and state, and the other of the nations, separation of powers, Montesquieu, and the nation state. Now, the concept of the separation of church and state is part of the foundation in Western society of constitutional law, and is based on this idea that English philosopher John Locke presented, and the argument he used was that the separation is necessary in order to prevent religious fanatics to use the state apparatus to enforce their views on others. That is Locke's view. I explain in the book that there are other reasons for this, and that has to do with how in Western scientific development, ethics was removed from science because of the struggle of science against the church, and that one of the logic was then remove the church out of the state, not only of knowledge production, but also of the political theory. Okay, so this is the concept, and let me go into the critique of the concept. My first critique is that it is logically inconsistent with other liberal concepts of democracy and individual freedom, because it raises 2 questions. How is a democracy, the will of a majority, related to freedom? And what about non-religious fanatics who want to use the state to impose their view on others? A central tenet in liberalism and in the constitutional law of liberalism is that a democratic state should respect the will of the majority. But what if the majority wants a state based on their religion? So the majority wants a state based on the religion, but the political theory said that it should not be done. So there's a conflict there. And if a government wants a separation of religion and state in a country in which the majority clearly don't want it, then the only choice will be a massive repression of civil liberties of the religious masses. And in this case, the choice is simple. Either you have a secular state based on repression of the majority, or you have a religious state that is democratic, and there's no separation of religion and state. Now, there's a case of this, obviously, in Iran, with the revolution in 1979. It's a country consisting of 99% of Muslims, of which 80% belong to the Shia branch. And in a coup d'etat organized by the British, which led to the establishment of the Pahlavi dynasty, when the Mossadegh in 1951 became prime minister and wanted to national oil industry, he became very popular. And 2 years later, the US and British intelligence agency organized a coup against him and overthrew his government. And that established then this ruthless dictatorship of the Pahlavi dynasty that turned Iran into a fully secular state in which the notorious secret police Safak crushed all forms of political opposition. So either you have a massive repression of the religion masses and a secular state, or not. That's the case of Iran. It's not a general rule. Now, when the masses of Iran overthrew the secular Shah, they organized a referendum to rename the political system of Iran as the Islamic Republic. They got 99% of the votes. And then in December, a second referendum was held about the constitution. And again, that was approved by 99% of the voters. And the preamble of the constitution says, the constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran sets forth the cultural, social, political, economic institutions of Iranian society on the basis of Islamic principles and norms, which represents the earnest aspiration of the Islamic Ummah. The Ummah is a religious community of Muslims. Now, here you have a democratic vote for establishing a state which is not based on the separation of church and state. So let me see where I am. Yes, here I am. So my critique is that this concept of separation of church of state is not universal, based on Eurocentrism, and is logically inconsistent. Now, I don't go into here, but I deal in the book with the Iranian constitution and how the state has been structured in such a way that it has separation of powers, but also mechanism to ensure that the idea of the majority, which is the Islamic State, is respected. Let's take Montesquieu's concept of separation of power. And Montesquieu's argument was based on how to protect the freedom of the individual from despotic reign. And that is the basic argument. So the separation of power is an institutional guarantee for ensuring that the individual can enjoy his freedom. And it provides the mechanisms to govern the state with check and balances. And the government of the state is therefore divided into 3 branches with its own rights, powers, and responsibilities. The legislative, executive, and judicial branch. That's the political idea of liberalism. Then I go into the critique of this concept. Obviously, first is just a hypocrisy of it, because when he articulated the concept, it wasn't applied in the colonies of France, which were ruled like an absolute dictatorship. The people were enslaved and treated like chattel. So you talk about the necessity of protecting the individual from absolute dictatorship, while at the same time you don't criticize the dictatorship in the colonies. In fact, you justify it, as Montesquieu has done by justifying slavery. The second point of critique is the pretension of universalism as the only valid political system. But it is based on the ethical value of individualism as the most important principle in society. That is ethical. It's not scientific. It's ethical. So another society might legitimately consider collective welfare as the most important principle, like in many non-Western civilizations. So by presenting it as objective and universalist, it's basically dishonest. The third point of critique is that by limiting it to 3 branches, obviously there are no other political systems possible that are democratic. In the case of Iran, they have a fourth branch, the Guardian Council, which guards the Islamic nature of the political process in Iran. In Venezuela, the constitution of the Bolivarian state acknowledged 5 branches of power. Public power is distributed also into additional branch, which is the citizens and the electoral branch, which their own functions. And I won't go into the task of it now, but the idea what I want to convey is that by using the trias politicas as a universal model, you exclude other possible constitutional constructions. The fourth point is that it requires secularism as the basis of government. And as I explained, that could lead to the limitation of democratic rights of the people. Fifth point is it presumes that laws are just. So they don't have an instrument to deal with unjust law, like apartheid. So if the legal system of a country is unjust, which I don't have to argue for the case of apartheid, how does trias politica deals with this? There's no mechanism. And the last point of critique is it assumes neutrality of the judicial branch, but we know now that the judicial branch can be part of political warfare called lawfare. The trias politica has no mechanism of it. These are critiques which you could develop of the trias politicas. The other thing in constitutional law is the concept of the nation state, that one nation lives in one state, and a nation means a culture. So everyone living in that state must adapt to the culture. And my critique is that eventually this kind of concept will lead to suppression of individual freedom and racist practice, as is clear in France. Article 1 of the French Constitution says France shall be an indivisible, secular, democratic, and social republic, and stipulates that education should be secular. So in France, they are very extreme and have a word for it, laïcité. But once you do that, then what will happen if you have, I argue that liberalism and Marxism are a secular version of Christian theology. You see the mechanisms and the argument structure of Christian theology, of the absolute truth. You see that also in the Western Enlightenment. So if you have a nation state, how do you deal with communities that don't agree with that principle? The Constitution of France has an article that prevents even the amendment of the Constitution regarding its secular nature. The Republican form of government shall not be the object of any amendment. In France, there are 5 million Muslims of a population of 65. So what if those Muslims argue for expressing their religious identity in public? They're not even asking for Sharia, just that, then you need to repress it. And that is exactly what's going on in France, where in 2004, the French Senate approved a bill that prohibits the wearing of religious symbols in public schools. The individual freedom to dress how you like, is forbidden by law. And the European Court of Human Rights, which is significant, upheld the ban when a French woman brought it to the court. So here I take constitutional law, and then what are the how does a constitution look like for a state which is pluriversal, which has different nations? The Constitution of Bolivia explicitly names itself as a pluriversal state. I'll go back to Iran because of the fact that the separation of church of state was removed there. And the interesting thing is that in the constitution, they acknowledge that they are not the only religious thought within Islam, because they are Shia. So in the constitution, it says that other Islamic schools, the Hanafi, Shafi'ah, Maliki, Hanbali, Saidi, they are accorded with full respects, and they even should have the ability to have a legal system based on their specific interpretation of Islam. The jurisdiction of local councils in those areas can operate on the basis of it. Non-Muslims have similar rights within the constitution, and even non-religious groups, secular groups, have this rights enshrined. So in the political system, they even have reserved seats in parliament for specific ethnic groups. And this is an example of a state based on religion, based on the pluriversal concept of nation state, and still offers more freedom and democratic rights than in a secular state. Now, you can't discuss Iran in the West because of the demonization and all the ideas of the backward mullahs, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who issues fatwas against Rushdie. So all these things prevent that you look at a rational way into it. Now, let me apply the whole thing. I found a case of Guarani. I think everybody knows the case, knowing Guillermo. So I tried to see how we take a specific case in law and how do you apply the DTM methodology. So what I do, I look at the key concepts. To what extent are they Eurocentric? Was it critique? What is the alternative concept? And what is the practical implication of it? In the Guarani case, the basic question is, first of all, is a law a just law? Which is not a legal question, but an ethical question. And each community has its own concept of justice and its own legal concept. So what are the concepts of the Guarani community? And Guillermo refers to Article 231 from the Constitution of Brazil. In you shall have the social organization, custom, language, creeds, and tradition recognized, and use that as an instrument to create a space to develop a pluriversal interpretation of the legal system, so that you could acknowledge concepts which are part of that community. So the discussion about decolonizing law is the discussion about how does the nation state and its legal system applies to a pluriversal state. And I dealt with it in general terms. Then the aim of criminal law, where generally spoken in Western law, the aim is punishment. I argue that in a case dealing with criminal law, in a paragraph dealing with, that there are situations possible where killing of people is not resolved with punishment. For example, the Truth and Reconciliation Committees, which are all across the world, where countries have to deal with political violence. The aim of dealing with political violence is not to punish the perpetrators per se, but to promote social stability and have mechanisms of dialogue, truth finding, and reconciliation. And this would be impossible in a system that starts from the individual as the basis for criminal law. In the case of the Guarani law, which is not about political violence, the argument about the purpose of the law and how to deal with the perpetrator is to prevent the perpetrator to exist in the spiritual corridor that the community had created with its rituals. It's a different purpose. You bring the discussion of decolonizing the law back to the question of how does the criminal law function in the pluriversal state? What is the aim of the criminal law? What are the concepts that are used? And that's what decolonizing criminal law is based on. Now, in general terms, so what I've done is develop this DTM methodology. And in the case of law, the methodology is to try to isolate the key concepts, analyze the concepts, develop a critique of it, look at alternative concepts, develop new concepts, and lay down the implications of it for the world civilization. That is it. Thank you very much for your attention, and let's have the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Are you listening?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Sandew. I think it was a extremely clear and didactic lecture, and I think we can move on to debates. I don't know if anyone have any question to ask. We have one professor. Professor Elena wants to do, but first.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you, Professor Hira, for this wonderful presentation and the sound foundation of the decolonial theory. Yes, I have a question that concerns judges and concern. I base my reflection on Italy, where I read several judgments regarding migrants in Italy that clearly contain Eurocentric, at least, affirmation, Eurocentric statements, like we should defend the value of civilizations against barbarian cultural practices. The supreme values of Italian constitution should not be overcome by uncivilized cultures, and so forth, so on. I guess that this statement are how can I say, are not made conscious, because in Italy there is not a debate about decolonizing, because Italy forgot its colonizing past, which was actually very little, only the 20 years during fascism. So it's not a big colonial power, but still maybe I define them more Eurocentric than colonial. I wanted to ask you if in the policies to raise consciousness and to fight the colonial mind, what do you, if you have in mind something specific dedicated to judges to promote judgments like the one on the Guarani case, that instead, on the contrary, reveal a strong decolonial consciousness? So policies for judges.
Yes, very clear. Well, let me first start with the concept, because of your analysis. And one of the concepts you mentioned is that Italy was not a big colonial power, and therefore the whole question of decolonizing, how does it fit if you're not a big colonial power? So let me give you an example. Japan was not even a classical Eurocentric colonial power. They were colonial within Asia. And yet Japan is very colonized in the mind. Why? Because you don't need a colonial empire to be colonial. Because colonialism is about civilization. and not about a specific country colonizing other specific country. You could have in Hungary or in Russia or in Czechia or in Poland, countries that have no colonies, but they are based on the Enlightenment philosophies. And I explain in my book that the Enlightened philosophy was a racist philosophy. So the idea of inferiority, of barbarism, of civilizing the uncivilized, you don't have to have colonies to adhere to that theory. So your instrument in having the discussion with the judges is not relating to the question whether or not they have colonies, but whether or not they adhere to the Enlightenment. And that is clearly the case, you see, because the Enlightenment is the foundation of colonizing the mind. Now, what is interesting, if a judge says, look, I want to be not racist, I don't want to be a racist, you know, and I want to have a frank discussion with you, if you argue that I'm racist, then I find the Guarini case so very interesting on the discussion of the role of judges. Because what Guillermo did was going to the Constitution and looking for that space. And he says in his article, even if it's just vaguely mentioned, because it doesn't refer to a pluriversal state of Brazil, but by articulating, you know, the respect for Indian cultures and customs, etc., he, as a judge, he has an instrument to discuss whether you should take into account the legal tradition of that community. Now, in the case of Italy, it's even more clear because I haven't seen the Constitution of Italy. I looked into the Constitution of Brazil and Iran and so, but I guess even Constitution of Italy, there must be something like equal rights for individuals, right? That everybody is equal before the law. So if that's the case, how does that relate to the fact that you view other people as inferior, which means barbaric, you know? And so you have a discussion, but if you see the people with, if you argue that the Constitution said that you should treat everybody equal, but then in practice they are treated unequal, where are you as a judge? Are you being subjective and selective, you know, by excluding that in your you know, your considerations? That is a discussion you can have with judges. And then I don't, if you want to go into, but you say you are not racist, but basically I can argue that you are. But because those type of decision is emotional with them, you know, if you say to somebody you're a racist, then they don't listen to you anymore. So you have to have other type of arguments, basically to say, but your argument goes against the Constitution.
Thank you for, yes, actually, this is a very good legal argument. Let's apply the Constitution and not apply the, I mean, even the law that is unconstitutional.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Elena and Sandew. Would anyone have another question? Professor Rui is a professor of Federal University of Paraná. He's not able to talk, but he's following the event and sent one question for me. I'll read, if it's possible, Sandew.
Mm-hmm.
Professor Rui says, "Dear Professor, let me congratulate you for your brilliant speech. Thank you for the presentation of your ideas, which particularly enlighten legal knowledge in developing countries. My question is how to deal with the importance done to human rights in contemporary legal regimes and the necessity of a decolonial mind. Are human rights, as Professor David Kennedy says, it's part of problem or is it possible to develop a decolonial mind together with the human rights ethos? Thank you very much for your answer and again for your presentation, he says.
That's a great question. And the reason why I think this great question is I just yesterday finished a paragraph on human rights in the part of the section that deals with law. And again, when I apply the methodology to human rights law, then obviously my first critique is that the Eurocentric view of human rights is based on the individual, the rights of the individual, right? So the rights of the individual to be protected from all kinds of horror things. So that is how the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 was established. Now, my critique is that if you take that as your main entrance, then obviously you forget a lot of other things which are basic human rights, because human rights are rights of humans. And if you define human only as an individual and not as part of a society, suddenly you don't have to talk about duties anymore. Because if within the human rights system, you have also articles that deal with duties, then suddenly human rights is not only about rights, but also about duties. Now, there is a human rights declaration that deals with duties, and that is in Africa. It's the African Declaration of Human Rights. It was adopted, I think, somewhere in 1990 or so, but that deals with the question of how to protect human rights in relation also to society. So you take society as the basis of human rights. But once you take society as the basis of human rights, which means that if society is improving, it should also improve individual rights. But vice versa might not be the case. Mm-hmm. You could promote individual rights while at the same time go against social rights. That's the whole discussion that legal scholars in China are arguing against Western critics. They say in China, in 40 years' time, 800 million people have been uplifted for poverty. For them, that's a great improvement of human rights. Because with the uplifting of poverty, it's not just only providing food, which also is human right, providing shelter, providing medical, all these things are human rights. If you concentrate on individuals, you almost get always about civil rights, political rights, and not about human rights. You narrow human rights to individual civil rights. But if you broaden it to social rights, then you will see that by improving the life of people, they become more free in society. They have more agency in society. So, and then it goes even further. Not only duties, the same African Declaration talks about people's rights. Not only about human rights, individual rights, not only about duties, but also about people rights. And they list what the right of a people is. For example, the right of a people is the right to peace. Simple. A people has the right to live in peace. So the invasion of Iraq, they argue, is a violation of human rights. The right to live in peace. So you see, once we go into the discussion of human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not universal, it's Eurocentric. And other declarations are possible, there are alternatives. The Organization of Islamic States has the Islamic Human Rights Declaration that also takes in the idea. They have all, in all these, in the African, in the Islamic, they have all protection of individual rights. It's already there. You know, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom, you know, what all these things are there. But they also take in the right to be religious, not as freedom of religion, but as a concept of belonging to the Ummah, which is the community of believers. So I think this question of human rights with human rights law is a very big issue in the world, because obviously it comes up all the time, but as a political instrument and not even as legal discussion, which I think should be the case.
Okay, thank you, Sandew. Isadora wanted to do a question. We are not listening.
I don't hear her.
Yeah, we are not hearing. I don't know what is happening.
Put it in the chat.
Do you prefer to write?
Oh, okay. Too bad. Too bad.
Okay. I don't know if anyone, but Professor Hughes sent me another question, and he says about the mentioned concept of crime against humanity. How do you see the tendency of the creation of a universal criminal system with main criminal concepts designed to be adopted by all countries as mandatory?
That's the same thing about human rights, because the Human Rights Declaration was adopted as a universal declaration. So once you go, you think about the concept of a crime against humanity. What is a crime? What's the concept of the crime against humanity? And very easily you come into the concept of genocide. What is genocide, and how do you find genocide, and how does genocide different from if you kill 10 people instead of 100,000? Is it just a quantity measure, or is it also a qualitative measure? You see, so what happens if you talk about let's say a charter for a crime against humanity, then if you take the liberal Enlightenment view of it, you might think of it in the concept again of individuals or a collection of individuals. But if you argue that it is communal based on groups, then suddenly the question of historic injustice comes into play. Because an individual, when he dies, he dies. But a community doesn't die. So the community of people who have been enslaved from Africa, or the community of the indigenous people of Abya, where 90% of them have been killed, that historic injustice, if it qualifies as a crime against humanity, then you deal with it. But if you don't accept communities as an agent in the crime against humanity, and you think of it in terms of massive groups of individuals, which are still individual, a collection of individuals is different than a community, because a community has historical traditions. A collection of individuals doesn't have it. A community has a language that doesn't exist with the individual. It has culture, but it has also identity. And the history of enslavement is part of how their identity have been formed, the legacy of it. So when discussing crime against humanity, again, when we take the conceptual approach of decolonizing the mind, you discuss it in a different way than if you do it in my view, on a non-scientific basis, we just think that everybody accepts crime against humanity as a horrific thing that has been done to people. But the political implication of this is very, very different, because if you take the decolonial approach, suddenly reparations is central on the agenda. And I'm not talking about reparations, I'm talking about reparations for 300 years of a crime against humanity. See? So discussing crime against humanity is not, there are two views of it. The general, view of it's a horrible thing that has happened, but we shouldn't have let it happen in the future, versus, oh, there's a legacy, because community base is different.
Oh,
Okay.
I think can you hear me?
Oh, yeah,
yes,
I can
perfect.
hear you. Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you, Sandew. This was a lot to absorb, and I don't even know if my question is really well developed, but it's actually subdivided in two parts. And first I wanted to know from you, I didn't want to lose the opportunity to ask that. I have seen that in the first step of your methodology to critique a discipline, you suggest that we should analyze other civilizations and how they developed in their knowledge production some concepts to understand the same situation. And I have somehow a problem with it, because I don't know if we can be unbiased from our Eurocentric view of the world. So if we can have enough freedom of those bias to analyze different knowledge productions. I mean, I think we're talking about different ontologies and not different ways of seeing the world, but also different worlds. So I'm thinking about, for example, indigenous conflicts, and how could we use their conflicts to compare or to criticize the same conflicts in Western liberal societies. Like, can we, as Western educated scholars, for example, suggest a methodology to analyze all like different societies and different knowledge productions from this outside point of view, from this yeah. And the next question is actually because I'm trying to work with decolonizing constitutional cases, and I was thinking, when you mentioned this idea of thinking of the function of a certain institution in liberal Western societies, and to make a critique, trying to understand if this function of this institution could be different in different societies. I was wondering if constitutional law has a function other than giving to a small amount of people the power to interpret the law, and if it's not only an institution, a Western democratic liberal institution, to avoid radical democracy. So, I mean, I don't even know if we can, in the process of decolonizing law, defend the continuity of a constitutional court, for example. I mean,
it's clear. Your question is very clear. I understand it. I hope I understand it. Let me start with the first thing.
Yeah.
Again, I look at your concept. Basically, as I interpret it, you see the researchers as an individual, and especially an individual within the Western context who reads books and study material, etc. But if you come to the concept of the researcher as part of a collective, then it becomes much easier, because you don't pretend that you know the other civilization and you can interpret it. If I'm talking about the Muslim civilizations, I'm not going to read Muslim texts and try to figure out. Obviously, I read Quran, I read the thing, obviously, but I don't pretend that I know it. So what I do, I go in conversation with Muslim scholars. You see, That's the best way to learn, by the way. That's even the most efficient way to learn. You know, by going to those people from those civilizations who already have it. That's why you'll see in my book, when I discuss, let's say, economic theory, and I want to discuss the Islamic or the Buddhist or the Chinese economic theory, I don't go into interpretation. I quote the sources and their interpretation, you see. A thing I do a lot in the book, I quote very much the primary sources of everything. So basically, I think, how could we prevent the fact that you have bias in your interpretation of other civilization by not being an individual, by presenting decolonizing theory not as an individual endeavor, but an endeavor of people which are diverse in their opinion. Then the second thing is, how can you use institutions that by themselves are very colonized? Take in the case of constitutional law, and that's why the Guarani case has, for me, different interesting aspects, you see. And one of the interesting aspects is the role of the judge, because the judge in the Western liberal things, basically the aim of the judge is obviously not to interpret the law, but to apply the law. You know, so just should be say, I have this case, and which rules apply to the case. Now, here is the interesting thing of the Guarani. A judge can step beyond that if he wants and say, I do not only apply rules, I take the liberty of interpretation. In this case, the interpretation of the Constitution, and specifically the Article 132 or 132 of the Constitution, and use that in my ruling. You see? So what I would argue is that looking at a system in a practical and pragmatic way is more useful than looking at it in a principled way. Because if you take a look at the principled way, then you easily come to, we can't do anything unless a revolution is there that breaks down all these institutions. And that's it. But we learn from history that even if the revolution is there, you don't have even the certainty that you will have a better life. You know, of many revolutions which intended to be great and improvement of life, but at the end of the day, they weren't. They were replacing other repressive institutions. So my argument would be that take a closer pragmatic look of how to use the system in order to move the emancipation of a group a step further. You see?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Isadora, for your question. Sandew, anyone have another question? I think we can close this event. Thank you very much, Sandew, for your lecture. I think it was very important sharing your knowledge with us, and I'm sure that you gave us a lot to think about and an important contribution to our research. I would like to thank all professors here, Professor Rui, Natalia, Professor Clara, Professor Del, Professor Elena, and also I'd like to thank you all for listening and for being here. And I wish you all a good afternoon, and I hope to see you in our next events. Thank you very much, Sandew.
Thank you, Guillermo.
Goodbye.
Thank you, all the other participants. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.